So you're ready to start assignment 2, you're feeling comfortable with metering. What is your assignment? So we're going to break it into two halves. So the first half of the assignment is focusing on depth of field and creating a depth of field pair of images. So the creative use of depth of field, you're going to reveal something in one photo that is not evident in the other. So what this means is that you're going to focus on the same foreground subject. On one image, you're going to use a very wide aperture that is going to create a shallow depth of field. You're going to figure out the exposure for that, what shutter speed matches that, and shoot a photograph that shows that shallow depth of field. For the second of the pair, you're going to move your aperture to a very small aperture setting, like f/22. And you're going to have to move your shutter speed accordingly to let in more light, because you'll now have reduced your light tremendously by going from a wide aperture to a very small aperture. But that small aperture will give you a very broad depth of field. So you're going to try to creatively figure out something in the background. So in this shot, notice that with the small aperture, the f/22, there is a very broad depth of field. Everything is in focus from near to far. So the foreground subject is in focus, as is the background object that is revealed now through this broad depth of field. Conversely, this image that has a very wide aperture, 1.8. Now, you may not have that wide of an aperture available to you on your lens. That's fine. If that's the case, you may just want to have your background object subject be further away, right? Because depth of field will not be as shallow if your widest aperture is 5.6, but you can still achieve a very similar result just by controlling that perspective of objects from near to far. So you can be really creative with this. And even if you aren't super close to your foreground subject, like in this top one right here, the background is a little bit soft. It's soft enough that the background subject is, clear in one and a little bit fuzzy in the other. If the student had wanted to make this effect even more apparent, he could have just moved a little bit closer to the subject in the foreground, and that would have shrunk depth of field even just a little bit more. He was already using his widest aperture, so that wasn't possible for that shot. But in this one, again, these are both using a 5.6 aperture. By moving closer to the foreground subject and having the background farther away, it's a very soft focus in the background. So you have a lot of options here. The important thing is, again, just to make sure your foreground subject is in focus for both shots. The most common mistake people make is just to change where they're focused. So that you shouldn't do. You just keep the same foreground subject for both shots. All you're changing here is your aperture and shutter combination. So one image is going to have a wide aperture with a faster shutter speed. The other one is going to have a much smaller aperture with a much longer shutter speed. But they'll both be equivalent exposures. The same amount of light is reaching the sensor in both shots. What changes, though, is the aperture creating depth of field. So again, you can really come up with some interesting and creative scenarios for these. Just, make sure that you're controlling the variables, and all that's changing here are the aperture and shutter combination. So the most common errors, again, for the depth of field pair, don't use the same aperture for both shots. That's the most common mistake people make, is they just sort of forget that they're using a wide aperture and a small aperture, and they try to just change where they're focused. That's not changing your depth of field. It's just focusing where that difference is, right? So you're going to have an out of focus foreground and a focus subject in the background if you just focus on the background. That's not what we're looking for. You want to have the foreground subject be in focus for both shots and allow your background subject or object to come in and out of focus just using depth of field as opposed to using your lens focus. So again, to show this technique, you have to keep all the other elements the same and only change your aperture and shutter combination. So it seems really simple, but again, people kind of have this problem where it becomes hard to remember that your camera's not showing you your widest aperture it's only showing you your widest aperture setting. It's never showing you the broad depth of field that you can see at f/22, for instance. So say you had your camera set to f/22, you're not actually seeing that until you use something like a depth of field preview button that previews a depth of field you're seeing. Remember, your camera thinks you want as much light as possible to see and view the scene. So it is always showing you your widest aperture setting for any given image. That's what you're seeing looking through your lens. Even if your camera is set to f/22, your camera doesn't actually close the aperture down to f/22 until you press the shutter button. Up until that point, it leaves it at its widest aperture, so you have more light coming into your camera to control the scene. So when you click and hold your depth of field preview button, you'll notice the first thing it does is get darker. It gets darker because that aperture lets in much less light. But you should also be able to see that there's more in focus in the background when you depress that depth of field preview button. Otherwise, you have to just trust that your camera is going to shut down to whatever aperture you've pre-selected if you've selected a small aperture, and that then the depth of field will grow around your focus subject. So again, it's sort of counterintuitive, this half of the assignment, which is why it's sort of hard to break this idea that what we see looking through the lens is exactly what we're going to get. You will if you're taking a shot that's showing you a shallow depth of field. Remember, your camera is always showing you your widest aperture setting. So as you focus on, your subject in the foreground and the background looks blurry behind it, that's fine. That's the result you're going to get if you happen to be at that aperture. But you have to just remember, if you're in any aperture that's smaller than that, depth of field is going to be broader than what you're seeing looking through your lens. So this assignment is really geared towards getting you to kind of let go of that idea and to understand that as you control depth of field, even though you're not seeing it looking through your lens, depth of field is going to be expanding in front and behind your focus subject. So a couple tips. On your DSLR, make sure you, again, always use manual exposure mode. In this course, we're only going to be using manual exposure mode pretty much from this point on. And make sure your lens is set to 50 millimeters. This is also very important. So if you're not using 50 millimeters, if you're using a much more wide angle lens setting like this, like a 24 millimeter setting or an 18 millimeter setting, those wide angle lens settings unfortunately create a very broad depth of field. So even if you're trying to get this shot that's giving you a shallow depth of field, you're not really going to see that if you're still using a wide lens setting. So it's going to undermine the effect you're trying to create. And remember, this is again asking you to keep all other elements the same. Same framing, same focus, same distance from your subject, same ISO, same lighting, etc. All that you're changing here is your aperture and shutter combination. Next, select your widest f-stop, meter to find the right shutter speed at this aperture. This is also very important. And then, take a photograph. Remember, your camera is always showing you your widest aperture. So if you're set to your widest aperture, then you're fine. What you're seeing is what you're going to get. But if you notice that the background doesn't look very blurry to you, you probably need to move closer and refocus on your foreground subject. The closer you move, the more depth of field just shrinks right around your focus subject. So move close enough where the background looks substantially blurred. If it doesn't look blurry enough, you might also need to have a background that's farther away. So next, change to a very narrow f-stop such as f/22. Make sure that you remeter. So now you've gone a whole bunch of stops from, say, f5.6 down to f/22. Each time you stop down, it's getting more and more dim. Less light is coming through your lens, which means your exposure is going to be more and more underexposed if you don't adjust your shutter speed to compensate. So after you change your aperture, make sure you also change your shutter speed to compensate. Remeter. Now also, because you're stopping down to a small aperture, you need probably a lot more light to make the same exposure, which means your shutter speed gets longer. If it's too long to handhold, i.e. it's under about 1/30th of a second, 1/50th of a second, make sure the camera is stabilized on a tripod or other steady surface so you don't have camera shake. And again, when you're done, just review your images and make sure they're both correctly exposed, and make sure that they both have the foreground in focus, right? Only the background should shift in focus and be, out of focus in one and in focus in the other. But that should be through depth of field difference, not through a change in where you're focused. And your goal is to reveal something in one photograph you can't see in another. Be creative and try to think of some interesting concepts or subjects for your background that you can kind of play with in this way. All right, so if you have any depth of field questions, feel free to let me know. There are some instructional videos that I have up also that you can take a look at to get more familiar with these effects. After this assignment, you should have this technique down, and it should be much more clear. So part 2. For this part of the assignment, you're going to use various shutter speeds to create 2 images. One should capture a moving subject with some motion blur. So you're going to be using long shutter speeds to capture motion blur here. And you should have a significantly moving subject, and the camera should be stabilized so the rest of the scene looks nice and crisp and sharp. We're not looking at camera shake to create the image here, we're just looking at subject blur. So you'll need to use very slow shutter speeds, ideally 1/15 of a second or below. And since you're using slow shutter speeds, you'll have to use a tripod or stabilize your camera on a steady surface. If the camera isn't well stabilized, you'll either need to use a camera remote or a self-timer to avoid the camera shake that happens when you press the shutter button. But the blurred motion shot should be an obviously moving subject. You should shoot in dim light outdoors. Or dim light or outdoors or at night with a slow shutter speed. So you're going to be shooting probably around 1 second. It could be longer depending on what you're shooting, but the camera does need to be stabilized to prevent camera shake. I would really recommend having a good sturdy tripod. It's an essential thing to have as a photographer anyway, so if you don't have one now, it might be a good investment. Good tripods, again, they should be sturdy, they should be annoying to carry, they should be something that's not tiny enough to just fit in a small bag. Tiny tripods that aren't very stable can have the unfortunate result of breaking your camera. You put your heavy camera on a little lightweight tripod and have it really up high, and then you bump it or a little gust of wind happens and it falls over and your camera breaks. You need a tripod that's sturdy and stable enough to protect your camera as well. So again, you want to, play a little bit with motion blur. You have a lot of options here. There are some very creative, interesting things you can do with blurred motion. This one's a 30-second exposure. Here we have a 5-second exposure. So you want to have different subjects for the shutter speed half of the assignment, for the motion half of the assignment. So for this one, again, you want to shoot in pretty dim environments. That's going to be helpful, and you want to use fairly slow shutter speeds, such as 1/15 or slower. And again, you will have to stabilize your camera on a tripod or other steady surface as needed. Here we have a 1-second exposure, an 8-second exposure, 1/8 of a second, 20 seconds, 1 second, another 1-second exposure here. So for the last image, you're going to be capturing a moving subject frozen in action using a fast shutter speed, such as 1/1000th of a second. For this one, again, your subject should be totally frozen in motion. There shouldn't be any apparent blur. Because you're using fast shutter speeds, a tripod is not required. Your camera can be handheld just fine. You probably want to shoot this in bright light outdoors, so you can use faster shutter speeds. And for human motion, 1/500th or above is enough to freeze human motion for the most part. So don't use a subject such as a fan or a car to demonstrate frozen motion. I mean, with the frozen fan, it just looks like a fan that's not on. Same thing with a car. A car just looks stopped. So you want to choose creative subjects that make that frozen motion really obvious or apparent. Here's 1/500th, here's 1/1000th of a second. So understanding the relationships between depth of field, aperture, subject, and background distance, these are some of the most creative tools we have. Once you master these techniques and get really comfortable with manual exposure and choosing which aperture and shutter you want for a given shot, that's where the creativity comes in. Figuring out if you want a broad depth of field or a shallow depth of field, figuring out if you want frozen motion or blurred motion. All these are visual techniques you can use to have more artistry and control over the photographs you take. So I highly recommend reading the assignment page carefully to make sure you're showing all required techniques. You can bring it with you if that's helpful. So you're welcome to contact me with any questions, and I look forward to seeing your images. Best of luck.